Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming along today to the event here at the University of Glasgow on the Centres of Expertise. And thanks particularly to Anne-Marie and Michael of Circa Media, who have made a film about the centres, which you'll see in one moment. Quite a feat, considering it was during COVID. Thanks to the University of Glasgow, particularly Jane and Dom. Thanks for all the staff and the university for allowing us to have the event here. Thanks also to SEFARI Gateway and EPIC for helping organise this event, particularly Michelle and Jane. And also to the speakers, who you will hear more about later, and also to Scottish Government and RESAS for funding this research to enable us to be here today to discuss about the centres. So what we'll do is we'll start by launching this centres film. As world leaders gather in Glasgow for the UN Climate Change Conference, Scotland's 5 centres of expertise have joined forces to highlight just how much their work helps to protect the people, land, nature and businesses of Scotland. The 5 centres draw upon the huge range and depth of expertise and research carried out by the Scottish Environment, Food and Agriculture Research Institutes, by our universities and other organisations across Scotland, including industry.
We are SEFARI Gateway, Scotland's Environment, Food, Agricultural Research Institutes. We're the knowledge exchange and impact hub for the Scottish Government Strategic Research Portfolio. Having mid to long-term research is absolutely vital to addressing the strategic challenges that we face from the climate emergency, from nature emergency, from issues around people's diets, to the strength of agriculture, of rural communities and the economy. The Islands Revival project was an online project that then became a physical project that brought island communities, development organisations working with those communities, together with researchers to look at their specific needs and their specific opportunities with their communities. The Islands Revival project enabled researchers to connect in a very immediate way with a huge body of understanding and knowledge and capacity within remote communities. So it's crucial in how we shape our research for those communities. An example of the raft of knowledge that is held in local communities could be on their housing needs, their transport needs, their connectivity, and their schooling, for example. Where communities will be able to share their experiences, their practices, what works for them, enabling communities to act locally, to develop things that will work for them. SEFARI Gateway commissioned a think tank for conserving genetic diversity. This is addressing a major issue, obviously driven through the climate emergency. So looking at conservation of genetic diversity involves some of Scotland's most iconic wild species, and that includes Scots pine, moorland heather, red deer, and of course the red squirrel. And one of the crucial advantages of taking a conservation of genetic diversity approach is that it can help nature to help itself. The aims and outcomes for the Genetic Diversity Project are to provide a toolkit to evaluate and target the conservation of genetic diversity. The initial scope for the project was focused to Scotland. However, it is UK-wide and has subsequently become global. And this has led in the UK to the setting up of the UK's first genetic diversity conservation unit at Wester Ross. One of the benefits from SEFARI Gateway is that we work in partnership and build partnerships with policy, with business, with communities to deliver research that benefits Scotland's land, Scotland's environment and Scotland's communities.
So climate change is the rise in temperature and and the change in climate patterns that has been occurring over a very long period. And it's reached the point now where it's very obvious that it's actually a threat to the way we live. Climate Exchange is a centre of expertise on behalf of Scottish Government that focuses on things that we can do to help policymakers address climate change. And it works in two ways. It's a virtual centre that draws on research expertise from across Scotland and even beyond, but it also commissions research projects which are directly aimed at addressing a particular policy issue. One example of a project that Climate Exchange did recently in response to the COVID-19 pandemic was a project that was commissioned by Transport Scotland. And what they wanted to understand better was how people had changed their work-related travel behaviour in response to the pandemic. And the researchers looked at travel behaviour before the pandemic, during the pandemic itself, and then asked employers about what their plans were for after the pandemic. What it found was a big switch away from public transport and from things like car sharing. So that's an issue in terms of climate exchange and promoting a more sustainable use of travel. So one of the recommendations was to think about new types of schemes like park and stride. So these are new approaches which involve active travel and will hopefully again get people out of single-use cars. So this particular project fed in a lot of policy recommendations which will feed into Scottish Government plans for net zero. The Scottish Government has made a commitment to explore the potential of 20-minute neighbourhoods. And this is the idea that everybody should be able to access all of their needs within a 20-minute walk from their place of residence. So what the Climate Exchange Research Project found was that the physical infrastructure and the pattern of settlements in Scotland at the moment does support this idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods. And that's true not just in urban parts of Scotland, but across rural Scotland too. So in principle, it's a great idea for Scotland to follow to achieve all of these benefits. So Scotland has very ambitious climate change plans, and it's done incredibly well in terms of renewable electricity generation already. The next set of challenges relate to buildings, heating, transport, our land use sectors. So there's lots of issues that still remain, and each of us has a role to play in supporting that transition.
Plants, and therefore plant health, touch every aspect of our lives. All the way from food. Over 95% of the food we eat is plant-based, and the meat that we eat are fed on plants. We have all the managed and natural forests, we have woodlands and parks and all the plants in our gardens, and then we have the natural environment and the biodiversity within that. So if we have plants, then potentially we have problems with plant pests, and that's why the Plant Health Centre is playing such an important role. Scotland's Plant Health Centre is a virtual centre involving about 10 different organisations run by the James Hutton Institute, and it's a conduit by which Scottish Government, organisations and industry can get plant health information, so they can come to us with a particular request and we can then go and find the information they need and bring it back to them. And that can be useful for things like knowing how to deal with different pests and diseases on a farm, all the way through to government contingency planning for new pests and diseases coming into Scotland. A good example of a critical issue that the Plant Health Centre has been dealing with is one about an organism called potato cyst nematode, or PCN. So the nematode attacks the root system and it can actually greatly reduce yield. But more importantly, if you have potato cyst nematode in your soil, it means you can't plant seed potatoes. So it's right at the start of the potato production chain, and so it's really important that we deal with this problem as quickly as possible. Financially, it's already costing the industry about £25 million a year in lost seed production. It's predicted to increase in the next 20 years to 125 million, and there's even a possibility that in 30 years there won't be a seed industry left. Scotland's Plant Health Centre deals with a number of climate change issues. One thing that we're trying to do is to develop models that will better predict whether pests and diseases are going to cause problems in the future because of climate change. One example is an organism called Xylella fastidiosa, which is causing huge problems in Italy on olive trees at the moment, and that's a warmer climate pathogen. But it's very critical now that we make sure it doesn't come into Scotland. This organism can cause disease on many hundreds of different plants, things in the garden like lavender, all the way up to iconic oak trees, so it's really important that we keep it out. Society's changed a lot recently in terms of crop production, because formerly where we were looking for focusing on yield and we were using chemicals to ensure that we got that yield, chemicals to control pests and diseases, now we're looking at much more sustainable farming practices, which means that we have to find new ways to control these pests and diseases through methods like integrated pest management, better resistance in our crops, etc. So the Plant Health Centre has a very important role to play in that.
Human health and animal health are inextricably linked. Probably most importantly and most obviously that we get lots of our food from animals. So our centre of expertise is called EPIC, and that is a centre of expertise in animal disease outbreaks. So it pretty much does what it says on the tin. It exists to advise Scottish Government about animal disease outbreaks. The key bit about it though is it is a rapid response unit. It stands at readiness to advise the government in the event of unexpected crises. And that's a really key component of what we do. It's quite unusual for a research organisation to do that. We also conduct longer term research, but we need to be ready to and agile to respond whenever there's a request to do so.
So if an animal disease outbreak happens, such as foot and mouth disease, it's really important to control disease spread as quickly as possible. One of the ways that we use to do that is to put movement restrictions in place. So for example, preventing animals from moving between locations or preventing movements of animal products. So a recent example of where EPIC's work on veterinary risk assessment has helped Scottish Government to make decisions about disease control policy would be the outbreaks of avian influenza that happened as a result of the risk of transmission of bird flu from wild birds to domestic birds. There was a need to put in a housing order. So a housing order would put restrictions in place in terms of keeping birds indoors or protected from contact with wild birds to make sure that transmission can't occur between wild birds and domestic poultry.
Well, it's very difficult to predict precisely how climate change will affect animal health and welfare in the future. Certainly as temperatures increase, if they do, and humidity changes, then it's possible that some of the things that transmit animal diseases, such as midges, ticks, will find new places and new niches and may be able to transmit diseases that currently don't thrive there.
So increases in temperature in Scotland are likely to lead to a change in the diseases that we see. So that could be some diseases may spread more easily within Scotland, and it's also possible we would see increased risk of spread of diseases like blue tongue disease. Blue tongue disease is a virus which is carried by a midge vector. It can infect various species, including cattle and sheep, but particularly causes clinical infection in sheep. So it is something which have quite significant consequences for the cattle and the sheep industry in Scotland.
EPIC work is brilliant because we have a really close relationship with the policy people we work with. So the consequences of animal disease outbreaks in Scotland are potentially drastic, because there are a lot of diseases that we strive really hard to keep out of the country, and we're very successful at doing that. But should they arrive here, they would transmit very quickly and could result in huge losses in terms of animal death, poor animal welfare, and disruption to the food production system and the economy.
So the water cycle is the most important Earth system process on the planet. It affects all of our lives, at every stage of our lives, and in every corner of the globe. It's quite simple. Without water, there is no life. CREW, the Centre of Expertise for Waters, provides a boundary organisation that draws knowledge from the research community and helps support policy. By doing that, we really try and ensure that we get the right information to the right people, at the right time, and in the right way. So most recently, Crew was involved in resourcing and managing investigations into the use of wastewater in our battle against COVID.
We weren't expecting a global pandemic, but Crew had already been working with the different stakeholders in the water research, water industry. So those relationships, research funding was already present in the community. So when the crisis arose, it was possible very quickly for a researcher at the University of Edinburgh's Roslin Institute to develop a test for the COVID virus in wastewater, to use samples from Scottish water, to apply that test and develop it. Scottish Government's wastewater monitoring programme has been able to test the level of COVID-19 virus across the country in wastewater treatment plants. Without that early engagement, without the established connections across the research ecosystem, we could never have started that national programme so quickly.
For many, water is the messenger of climate change. We still have the same amount of water on the planet that we've always had, but it's the distribution in space and time that is our biggest issue. For many, we see pictures of too much water, too little water, and that's become the new norm. So we need to understand the dynamics of the flood and drought processes and how that affects our communities. As water flows through our landscape, we can use different techniques to slow the flow and try and protect our cities and infrastructure. That includes novel ways of looking at managing our rural landscapes and working with farmers and foresters, but also working with urban planners to provide resilience in our cities and towns to the potential consequences of flooding. So Crew supports the Scottish Government in its journey towards becoming a hydro nation. That's a vision for Scotland as a world leader in water research and in water management. So we need to refresh our relationship with water, be it in our rivers and streams, be it in the taps in our homes, or in the waste streams that we produce. We need to remember that every drop is precious. Truly valuing water means giving it the appropriate recognition, promoting efficient and wise use, and balancing our short-term needs against securing a sustainable legacy for the future.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for contributing to that film. I think it just shows the depth and breadth of information and knowledge by working with the research and the research institutes and the universities and with a wide range of stakeholders. We've really shown that we can make a real impact in many different areas. So now we're very fortunate today is that we've got a representative of each of those centres with us today, as well as a representative from RESAS. So it's a chance to drill down with the questions to really find out, you know, what they are doing and what they plan to do in the future for the people of Scotland and indeed for the world. So I'd like to first of all introduce you to Professor Bob Ferrier, the Director of the Centre of Expertise for Water, and he will tell us a little bit more about some of the examples of where Crew has made a real impact. Bob.
Thank you, Lorna, and welcome everybody. And yeah, it's a pleasure to just introduce some of the aims and the objectives and the challenges that we face within the Centre of Expertise for Water. I mean, the Centre was established to build resilience at that science policy interface and to help us pool knowledge to the people who need to use that knowledge. And the ambition is really framed around the fact that the science and policy and industry communities in Scotland are very closely tied together. In fact, they're only a phone call away many of the time. So this gives Scotland a real opportunity to develop knowledge and to see that knowledge move into action. Our centre covers a lot of existing topics and challenges in the water field, particularly around how we manage our catchments, how we promote approaches for sustainable use in rural communities, how we look at water quality issues, and how we deal with flood and coastal erosion. But more recently, some of the contemporary challenges have been around the low carbon challenge and the just transition. They've been about looking at green recovery. They've been looking at resilience and water resilient places. And I think that really reflects how the policy domain is moving and adapting to new issues that are evolving day to day. I'm not going to talk for too long, but I just wanted to try and say what makes a successful centre. We have a community of 15 universities and 5 research institutes that provide that knowledge from one side. We pull the stakeholder community together on the other side, and that includes our policy teams, our Scottish Water and our industry representatives, and also our stakeholder community, including our agencies. But really our success is about pulling that together as an integrated community, and an inclusive integrated community, bringing those two sides together. It's about providing a collective shared understanding of the challenges that we're facing. It's about generating consensus about how we could go around finding solutions to those challenges. And at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that that evidence is used to implement effective and positive transitions in the way that we manage our waters throughout Scotland.
Thank you, Bob. And I think you've demonstrated the real power of co-construction.
Absolutely.
So next on our panel, I'd like to introduce Professor Dave Ray from Climate Exchange. Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Lorna. And I'm going to echo Bob a fair bit. So, in terms of our centres of expertise, we operate on those similar models in terms of a lot of work which is drawing from our best academic researchers in Scotland and more widely in some of the long-term climate change questions. But we've got that really important role, particularly for the Scottish Government, in terms of being able to react. And Deb's example in terms of COVID, how it's affected travel and travel-related emissions, but then having a look at how it might play out in the coming months and years. And that kind of stuff is obviously crucial to Scottish Government in terms of their net zero strategy. I guess one of our key roles is to answer those specific questions, but actually to take a systems view. So we look at things like impacts of COVID on transport, but we also feed into things like the climate change plan for Scotland, which is across the whole economy, the whole of Scotland, looking at where there are potential opportunities, big research questions, talking to colleagues at Scottish Government about how they can be articulated and crystallised in terms of giving answers in the right time and the right place. And it's one of those things where, I love being part of Climate Exchange because, just like Bob said, you're working across just all these different academic partners, great expertise, industry also, and government. And it hopefully we give a lot to government in terms of giving good quality advice, but it gives a lot back to us as academia. So we have research fellows, for instance. Some of them will go and work within Scottish Government, so their experience of what the reality of policy is like, that's a brilliant thing for their career progression, actually, and to make them a rounded academic. And one of my favourite examples of our work over the last couple of years is there's a model for climate change called TIMES. Now, TIMES is used quite heavily by the Scottish Government in terms of looking at how different decisions might map out in terms of our progress to net zero with our ambitious targets. And that is something where, as an academic community, it's really important we understand what TIMES is, how the Scottish Government are using it, what assumptions are in there. So one of the things was not just having our research fellows in Scottish Government on secondments, but actually Scottish Government colleagues being seconded into us to actually work with our academics and build that understanding and capacity. So like Bob was saying, it's that phone call away, but it's not just a phone call away, it's kind of quite a quick conversation to get to the nub of the issue on whatever question it is. So yeah, I think in terms of where we are now, all of us in terms of our centres, huge pressure in terms of a lot of questions, and that reflects what Scottish Government are dealing with, what our whole country is dealing with across climate crisis, nature crisis, COVID, etc. But in the context of COP26 and talking to other nations about what they've got in this way of I guess, robust evidence provision, we're ahead of the curve in Scotland. We've got to be proud of that.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, I think we should be proud, and I think you've just illustrated the power of community, trust and legacy. And I think Scotland is showing the way for the world. Mm-hmm. So next, without further ado, Professor Dominic Mellor, I don't know Dom today?
Dom's fine. Thank you. Yep.
From the Centre for Epidemiology, Population Health and Infectious Disease Control. That's a mouthful, so we'll call it EPIC, won't we?
We will,
Dom,
yes.
over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and talking about EPIC. So EPIC came into being principally to advise the government about outbreaks of exotic animal disease, which are diseases, as I said in the film, that we don't have normally and we strive very hard to keep out of the country. The reason that we do that is because their impact through their high transmissibility on the animals themselves and the food production systems would be devastating in terms of animal death and wasteful loss of production. And so the existence of EPIC is really to help ensure that and support our agriculture industries to be as efficient as possible in producing animal products and utilising the food inputs that Ian spoke about in the film about Plant Health Centre as efficiently as possible. Over time, our role has changed somewhat, but that responding to animal disease emergencies is a major part of why we exist. And in that sense, we're a little bit different to the other centres in that we don't formally commission pieces of research. Rather, we have a team of people who are constantly working on projects that inform government's preparedness for outbreaks. At some time, we are in an outbreak response mode, which happens to be true at the moment. And in the current week and last week, we've had the first cases of avian influenza in poultry premises in the UK, and so a lot of our work has been very responsive to that. As the other speakers have said previously, that's a very difficult thing to rustle up from scratch, and I think lesson after lesson after lesson in the UK and overseas has shown that you're much better able to respond to things like that if you have a team that are well practiced, well honed and standing ready. So a lot of what EPIC does is to become familiar with the production systems, be familiar with the industry, be familiar with the pressures on industry, be familiar with the legislation, and be familiar with up-to-date data on these systems, where are farms, how many animals are there, and so on. And then we bring together expertise from essentially all of the institutions in Scotland which work in animal health. And that expertise is a combination of veterinarians, mathematicians, statisticians, economists, behavioural scientists and others to try and synthesize those different aspects in producing a sort of optimized solution for disease management and control and mitigation of the impacts of disease as much as possible. A lot of the time that means when there aren't outbreaks, we're working on diseases that we do have because they provide really good data-rich examples of situations about how different kinds of animal pathogens spread among those different species, and sometimes they spread among species and sometimes they spread between species, and we have lots of work going on those projects which contributes to the evidence base on those and helps make us ready and best prepared to respond in the event of an emergency. I would say that working closely with the policy teams, as the others have said, is an essential part of this, and maintaining strong relationships and trusted relationships with those stakeholders in policy and industry is as important to EPIC as it is to the other centres. Thank you.
Thank you, Dom. And that connectivity, that trust again, and the preparedness that has been brought about because of the research that's been built up in Scotland in the long term that's able to draw on that up-to-date data. So I'll now pass to our next panel member and introduce you to Fiona Burnett, who is the sector lead for agriculture in the Plant Health Centre. Fiona.
Thanks, Lorna, and yes, good to be here today. So the Plant Health Centre is the newest of the centres of expertise. We've been running for about 4 years, and we were commissioned at a time where public awareness on plant health issues was rising, so on the back of issues like ash dieback disease, and really recognising that Scotland's natural environment is very special when it comes to the plants that are there. So examples like Atlantic oak woods, our natural environment is unique on a world scale. But 3/4 of our land is down to some form of production as well. So as referenced in the film, food and crop production is a big and important aspect for Scotland. So that was the kind of backdrop to why having the centre. We deal, I'm kind of jealous of Dom dealing with a sort of defined range of animal hosts. We deal with up to, if you think of the plant species in Scotland, 10,000 species and millions of potential plant health risks on the back of that. And we are primarily, policy, and the Office of the Chief Plant Health Officer is a very key stakeholder for us. But our stakeholders are really broad, so plants touch everybody. Again, as referenced in the film, food is important, but by the time you take in everybody who gardens, everybody who cycles through a forest, that our stakeholders are just immense. And really in recognition of that, I lead for agriculture, but we have a sector lead for forestry, we have a sector lead for the natural environment and for horticulture. But then we've sought to broaden our core team by having a science and advisory response team. So that brings in another 6 experts and institutes, people who are kind of primed and ready to go if we have plant health issues. And bringing in, for example, modelling skills and particularly social science skills where we can think about behaviour change and really driving impact. So that's a lot of the backdrop to why we think a plant health centre is important. Our overriding aims are to improve the resilience of Scotland to plant health threats. So that's the banner headline. But within that, we have sort of sub-aims to work on emergency responses. So where there's an ingress, and there are about 1,000 plant health threats on the plant health risk register. So that's quite a lot to be horizon scanning for. So working on things like diagnostics, monitoring and surveillance. We have a particular brief to provide evidence to help our stakeholders make better decisions. So again, clearly government and policy is a very key stakeholder in that, but that evidence provision so we get sensible decisions made around plant health is one of our key things. Clearly agriculture and commercial forestry are big and successful businesses for Scotland in their own right, so we have an aim of improving the economic resilience of those sectors. And then, if you like, we have slightly softer aims in building the capacity and leveraging extra advantage. So we're very much about complementing and coordinating with others. So that idea that we work with others to understand the capacity to work on plant health issues, and that we kind of leverage value by linking with other work that's relevant. And then finally, with that sort of broad range of stakeholders and sectors that I've talked about, building networks is actually a kind of key aim of the centre as well, so that we have a community of plant health engagers and people that we work with quite closely. And I'm not ashamed of having that as an aim for the centre.
Thank you, Fiona. Quite a mycorrhizal network then, with over 10,000 plants. So fantastic how working with key stakeholders is really delivering to what we've got, our nature and our biodiversity crisis as well as the climate crisis. Yeah. So next I would like to introduce you to Dr. Charles Bestwick, Director of SEFARI Gateway, Gateway being the Knowledge Exchange and Impact Centre. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Lorna, and thank you for inviting me today. SEFARI Gateway is a knowledge exchange and impact innovation centre for the Scottish Government strategic research portfolio. Has to work across the breadth of that portfolio, and it's a huge resource of expertise in the centres of expertise themselves, and in the institutes that deliver the strategic research component of that portfolio. And within those institutes, that also incorporates the Scottish Government's funding of national capabilities and capacities within those institutes. And our remit is to bring that expertise and the access to those resources to a broad spectrum of stakeholders that need to deliver for policies across our environment, land, agriculture, food and rural communities in Scotland. And so that's a considerable task. And to achieve that, we very much have to take a very adaptable and flexible approach to our project designs. So we use a number of project vehicles that will either place researchers with stakeholders, with policy teams, with industry sector representatives, with communities, with government agencies. Alternatively, we have interdisciplinary groups that we draw from across the portfolio, researchers and knowledge exchange staff from across the portfolio, and combine these with expertise of our stakeholders to address specific needs of a particular policy or practice requirement that we have been charged to address. And in addressing those, we're looking at both the mid to long-term needs, but also we have to be reactive and responsive to emerging needs. So we have to do both. And this bespoke design is crucial, and co-construction of these projects with the stakeholders is absolutely vital to successful delivery. In terms of where we look strategically for SEFARI Gateway, clearly the climate and nature emergencies are extremely important drivers and driving change and action across all forms and sectors. We're dealing increasingly with green recovery from both innovative technology transfers through to practice change that will drive a green economy and green practices post-recovery from the pandemic. And underpinning all that is just transitions. And for example, we have provided underpinning research to support the Scotland's Just Transition Commission in its publication of its recent report on just transitions for Scotland. The challenge for us now is where we take those components of just transition and make them real on the ground in the different communities and the different policy sectors that the strategic portfolio represents. I'll leave that there.
Thank you, Charles. And that just transition and the fairness and equity that I think that's being carried out across these wide range of sectors by SEFARI and SEFARI Gateway and all the centres here is just amazing. I think, again, it's Scotland punching above its weight. Next panellist, who I have great delight to introduce you to, but I'm not going to say it is because he wants to introduce himself.
Thanks, Lorna. Lorna somewhat buttonholed me this morning after I wrote a poem in response to an entirely reasonable question, which is, how should I be introduced? This is going to be tricky because I'm going to have to switch parts of my brain, because once I've done this, I've got to then talk properly. But anyway, it's very quick. It's called Untitled, and it's thank you for your inquiry as to how I should like to be introduced on the panel for the discussion next week. Your suggestion of Dr. X suits me well. I think he was a villain from a Marvel comic, or perhaps the Rocky Horror, and I like camp after all. I thought about my other options. Dr. My Name does not suit my Quaker sensibilities, neither does first name, last name, ever since I read that heartfelt, dreary internet poem about casting off titles too easily as a patriarch and undermining those who need them to stand up. So I have resolved, introduce me as you do the others, or by preference, Dr. X. Anyway.
Thank you very much.
Not what I was expecting to be talking about this morning. Really to switch notes. Why does the Scottish Government fund the Centres of Expertise is probably the quick way for me to describe my bit of this. And the reason we really like the Centres of Expertise and we like that model is that it's about content, it's about context, and it's about structures. So the context is, as Charles was suggesting, that I sort of think of what we fund in terms of research as kind of being like a triangle. And at the bottom there's a thing called national capacity or underpinning national capacity, and that funds things like our soils collections and our potatoes collections and things like that, which you just have to keep funding, and they sort of churn on and they continue on like that. And they are very important in their own right, but they're clearly quite a long way from influencing policy and quite a long way from influencing industry or other organisations. And then the next slice up is the strategic research programme, and this is akin to a lot of the funding that also the research councils fund, where that's the vast bulk of where the money goes. That's on discovering new things, finding out new questions, answering those kinds of things. And then on the top of the pyramid is the centres of expertise, and that's where we expect the closest bit to be into us, but also the closest bit to be into industry and others, and where we expect to see the highest degree of relevance. And I think that context is really important, because it's without access to the wider academic community, the centres can't function. You know, they need to be embedded in their wider community, and they need to be credible with the people that they're talking to out in the academic world. Otherwise, when we try and use that evidence, that information, it's not credible. So that's the first thing. It's about context. The second is about the content, and this follows on from the credibility issue. And so the content needs to be sensible, the content needs to be credible, and the content needs to be created by experts. And I know that word has been in and out of popularity over the last couple of years, but I think there is a really core issue there, that on its own merits, expertise is needed, and without the people who can identify it, understand it, communicate it, it's no help. It's no help for policymakers. It's certainly not going to get into industry or into commercialisation. And so the last thing is about structures. And I think the reason we really like the Centres of Expertise structure is that you guys understand where you sit. We've got science advisors on our side, we've got social scientists on our side who can work as intelligent customers, intelligent conversation people that you can communicate with, and that we can communicate with you, so that the information that's coming out from the work that's being funded elsewhere can be turned into useful ideas for us. And I think one of the things that's really helpful is that having that existing structure, just as the example on wastewater was talking about, just as the example on several of the other examples that have come up just over the last few minutes, having those structures in place means that there are trusted people that we can go to and have those conversations and say, what do we think? Where should we be developing our policy? Where should we be developing our direction of travel? And I think those are the three things. And just as a quick illustration of how much we value them, we're creating a new one. So next year we'll be setting up the Biodiversity Centre of Expertise. We haven't got a snappy acronym for it yet. All are welcome. But that's because we really do recognise the value of this kind of intermediary organisation in connecting up different parts of the academic world and connecting up with government and the other people who are interested in using it. And I think that's a key thing for us in identifying why they're useful and how they're useful and why they're the easiest bit for us to explain why we fund. Because we're not a big research funder. The UKRI are much bigger research funders than us, and we're not an arm's length research funder. When we ask for money, we ask directly ministers to fund this individual project, which is a different situation for UKRI, where they go with their bundle of numbers and then all of the individual projects are identified by academics. So we're in a different situation as a funder to most funders, and I think the centres are in a different situation to most research institutes. And I think the combination seems to work well, but that's why we like to do it.
Thank you, Graeme. And I should say that Graeme is from RESAS and very eloquently showed the importance of connecting things up, having awareness of the direction of travel, the context, the trust, the credibility, and actually shortening that supply chain from the knowledge to the actual use of that knowledge. And I think that's very powerful, that model of the centres is so important in Scotland. And thank you, Graeme, for announcing that new centre. That's really exciting.
It's already been announced. Just announced
it. I think it's really exciting because it's an area we know with obviously the climate emergency, that's why we're here, but that's so linked to the nature biodiversity emergency. So these are areas, along with community health, along with our food supply, all these things, the animal production, the health, our natural environment, the water, our natural assets that we've got. So all of that together, I think the model for the centres really has shown by all our speakers today examples of where it's really worked. But I think what we'll do is we'll pursue that a bit further, and we'll ask each of the panellists in turn to tell us about an example where they think their innovative approach for knowledge exchange has really worked. Dave, we'll start with you. Could you give us an example of where you think it's had a real impact and made a difference?
Yeah, so I mean, I alluded to the fact that we've got that nice porous relationship in terms of Scottish Government as our key kind of partner and the academic community, and that works both ways. And one example that comes to mind, which kind of Bob alluded to as well, was around flooding. So one of the things we know in Scotland is the flooding risk will increase because of climate change, just the kind of laws of physics, and that's a big challenge for not just urban environments but rural as well. And that kind of advice into government is good if you can kind of say, okay, this is your flood risk and this is the kind of things you should take into account. But what we were able to do on that is actually provide the Scottish Government, through the fellows and through people working directly with them, extra support and technical support to kind of really understand the kind of, I guess from the academic point of view, how stuff that was happening on the ground, what the context of that was over different time frames, over different catchments. So that for me, the flooding one, because it's the classic thing, I guess, with all the stuff we're talking about is everything's quite urgent and important. But you have to prioritise and you have to make sure that you're kind of getting the best evidence base to bear. So like Graeme was saying, using really quality, using our expertise. We shouldn't be shy of the fact we have expertise and that needs to flow in. So the flooding one would be an exemplar for me where that relationship with Scottish Government's been really strong and very useful.
Thank you, Dave. I'll carry on with Bob now, because I think you can add to that one, can't you?
Dave's done the flooding. I'm actually going to go back to something that Andrew Mellor pointed out in the film, and that is really the support that the centres offered when we moved into the pandemic phase. And that was all built on the premise that viral RNA goes through your bodies and into your wastewater. And that wastewater is collected at different locations across Scotland and treated. So it provides a useful integrating point for monitoring and assessing whether and how COVID is moving through the population. And that supplements how we do the other form of monitoring, which is through population testing. So working with Scottish Water and with Scottish Environment Protection Agency, we have now, and the network of scientists, we've now established a national monitoring programme over 100 locations, 80% of the population, 14 different health boards to maintain that going forward should we suffer consequences of potential new variants or changes in how the population is responding to that. And that has really supported this whole field of wastewater epidemiology, which is almost an emerging science. How can we use our wastewater as an integrator of how we're functioning as a society and how drugs and compounds are moving through our system, be them from pharma or from viral infections. So I think the abilities of the centre to respond really quickly to that urgent pressing need and to deliver tangible outcomes and that be adopted in a national programme is a really good example of how the centres can deliver.
Thank you, Bob, and I think that illustrates because we had that data available, we had the knowledge that had been carried out by research that could then be applied in that crucial area, absolutely crucial in terms of saving people's lives. Dom, can you give us an example from EPIC, a really good example?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not sticking my neck out too far. I think I can claim that we feel we were really quite early adopters of the concept of knowledge brokers. These are people who are adept at speaking to policy teams and to scientists and sort of bridging the communication gap between them. Even though both speak English, they often speak very different terminology. And we identified people in EPIC who had aptitude and interest in doing that. And very early on, in more than 10 years ago now, we got them to use hot desks in the Scottish Government Animal Health and Welfare Division on a regular basis, so that they were interacting casually and informally with the policy scientists and advisors, as well as formally through meetings. And we found that improved greatly the way in which, how we were able to understand the questions the policy teams wanted us to answer. So if they say we want a Phillips screwdriver, we don't give them a spanner. And vice versa. And so that helped a lot to establish the trust, and it also helped us to understand the timelines and gave us confidence to say, your timeline isn't doable. I don't think we've ever done that. And sometimes the things we're asked to do, example as recently as last week, was we were asked about something on Monday and they wanted an answer the next day, which we were able to provide. Just about, but clearly the kind of science you can do in response to that kind of question needs to be tailored to that kind of question. Some of the questions they want to ask us, we can take longer over, but the shifting needs of what's happening in the real world might mean that some of that work gets paused or reprioritized. So I think the knowledge brokers have helped us greatly in doing that and actually embedding them with the policy team, almost so we're like the same team, and we've published outputs with the Scottish Government, which we're very proud of.
Thank you, Dom. Very much trusted knowledge brokers and teams of people working together. That's fantastic. You've set up that centre that really does work. Thank you. And Fiona, can you give us an example from the Plant Health Centre that has also made a difference in how you've changed the opinion and view of how we look after our plants in Scotland?
Well, and picking up on Dom's theme of kind of trusted knowledge brokers, again, with a very sort of complex plant health backdrop there, we set out quite early to map out where people in Scotland go to for their plant health information and how they like it. And we identified kind of key nodes of information, and again what we try and do is complement and leverage, so we hop onto their networks and amplify what we're doing. But the piece of work around what form people like their information in is really interesting as well. So for example, social media actually surprisingly little read and little trusted, and some of us academics might twinge, but academic papers, highly trusted but little read. So, and actually what people want is that, probably what the centres are about, it's the quick synthesis of information and that interpretation. And so that really has become our kind of go-to. And to pick an example, around agriculture, it might be trusted agronomists. And actually we know that farmers who use independent agronomists are more likely to apply a much higher level of integrated pest management practices. So that's given us an efficiency to kind of channel our information out, and we hope have more impact from a finite resource.
So working out with your stakeholder who your trusted stakeholder would be and building up that relationship over time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fiona. And Charles, in terms of SEFARI Gateway, could you give us an example of where an innovative approach has worked?
Yeah, and I've changed that example about 5 times now as we've gone along in my head. And I'd certainly commend that you do look at the ones from all the centres, the examples they've given, and the ones on SEFARI Gateway around genetic diversity conservation and the Islands Revival Project. But the one I'm going to pick to answer Lorna's question is actually around a fellowship that we based with National Farmers Union of Scotland on greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. And the National Farmers Union came to us because as a sector they're under huge pressure. They're under enormous fire from obviously around livestock, but actually in general agricultural production in general. There's a lot of activism in there, and there's lots of competing claims made. And the sector itself is not homogeneous. They need to, there are differences of opinion running through it. And they approached us to really help them cut through that, to provide expertise, to look at really what was known, what was fact, what was speculative and perhaps less than factual for information they were dealing with in both their perceptions of the issues and those outside agriculture's perception of them, and also really what wasn't known. And so agreeing 7 key topic areas with their board, the fellow was able to work on fact sheets for the sector, which they released both as easy to follow sheets of information, but also backed up with a narrative form that was utilized on social media. And this was a huge challenge for us as well, because it brought us into that social media conflict with those very issues that pervade the sector and pervade campaigners and others for climate change. And I think that in helping both the fellow and the sector to really work through those relationships, we perhaps we didn't always make friends for them, but we certainly helped to open up dialogue. Certainly within the sector themselves, the fact sheets have been hugely influential. They've certainly helped in their strategic forward-looking at climate reduction targets, and have really been a bedrock for them, I think, in going forward. And they've also, we've learnt from it as well. Where it's influenced strategic research, it's also influenced the way we do knowledge exchange and indeed how we engage in social media space. So it's been a two-way learning process.
Thanks, Charles. So it can be seen as a safe space, and I think that shows where SEFARI Gateway have been trusted by those stakeholders, so they're able to divest time and energy working with the key experts to deliver science where it really matters. Yep. Graeme, from RESAS's perspective, I'm not going to ask you to choose your favourite centre, because that's not fair.
No.
But an example that, because they're all linked together, aren't they? They're all interdisciplinary and cover similar areas.
They are, and I was thinking actually as everyone was speaking, a couple of things that really jumped out. Fiona, you were talking about the piece on what evidence, what type of evidence, what process works. And actually that is something that I think we would definitely echo. Obviously we have researchers and we have scientists in RESAS. We're probably the only people who read academic papers in our area. The further you go from us, away from us into the policy sphere, it's very unlikely that people are reading academic papers because they're just not in the right format. We can't get hold of them. That's another thing to bear in mind. A lot of academic papers are hidden behind paywalls or all sorts of things that make it very hard to actually access that information. And then they're written for a different audience, so they're not written in a way that necessarily picks out the most useful or relevant bit. And I think the kind of model that some people have in mind for how knowledge exchange should work is that there's a letterbox and they've got their idea and they should be able to post it through their idea, and then it gets turned into policy by somebody else. And actually I think what works really well, and I'll pick the example of the SEFARI fellowships. So we've had a SEFARI fellow come in, he was really helpful, really thoughtful, and that kind of ongoing relationship, that kind of knowledge brokering, that kind of working jointly and working together and having those conversations, I think that is a much more fruitful model for what works. And it isn't one that sits very easily. I think you have to be aware of it. It isn't one that sits very easily with sort of ref scores or impact scores or citations or things like that. And again, we're the only people who are going to think about that in government. The rest of government isn't thinking about that. Most policy officers aren't at all. So having that two-sided conversation, I think, is really it is really important, and it's something that is a distinct difference from the centres model from particularly people who spend most of their time just doing pure academic research. They sort of arrive with a thing. This is the thing they've done, and if you're not in at the start of that process and you don't know where it's come from and you don't know where their context is, how much to trust them, what the rest of the academic world thinks of them, all of those kinds of questions, you're much more likely to leave that one there and then work with the things that work and the people you trust and the relationships you've developed over years rather than the ones you've developed instantly.
And those trusts, the relationships, for example, with the science advisors, are absolutely priceless because they're aware, they read the papers, they understand what science is relevant for the future, what science is going to deliver to these centres that impact now.
Yeah.
And you ask someone in the street and they're going to look at the work of the centres and really see that it's made a difference, all the examples we've seen and heard about today. But because we're here, because this is COP26, and the focus is on the climate emergency, and rightly so, I'm going to again go in turn to speak to each of the panellists and ask them to give us an example that has really delivered to the climate crisis. Dave, that shouldn't be a problem from climate change, should it?
No. I mean, it's our raison d'etre, really. I mean, I suppose, so I would be remiss if I didn't show you this, which is the last 5 years in terms of how we provided evidence for net zero. So that's full of different case studies, projects. Anna Marta did an amazing job at actually synthesizing it in a way which is, I hope, really accessible across lots of different sectors. I suppose one of the big ones, so last week at COP, one of the most positive announcements was around deforestation and halting deforestation by 2030. And in Scotland, we've got big forest planting plans and targets, but one of our biggest sources of emissions and one of our priorities, going back to that, we have to really go hard at the priorities, is peatlands. And one of the things we've got in Scotland is a lot of peat, but a lot of expertise on that peat. And now it's included in our national reporting as well in terms of the emissions. What we were able to do with Climate Exchange is use, particularly colleagues at James Hutton, in terms of that kind of the evidence base, the science, so that when you're restoring peatlands, you know from the Scottish Government's perspective, from the stakeholders' perspective, what you're getting, what bang for buck you're going to get, and what kind of uncertainty you're working with. And so for me, that's one of that has to be a priority for Scotland, is restoring our peatlands, but it has to be done in an evidence-based way. And that's a real strength of Scotland and Scottish research and science. But I think for Climate Exchange, we've played our part in that already.
Brilliant. And did you go to the pavilion, the Peatland Pavilion, Dave?
So I still haven't made it to that, because when you go into the pavilion zone, you'll just end up with a glass of wine, and you know how it is. But I will do this week, definitely.
Fantastic. And Bob, can you tell us from the water's perspective, obviously with all the issues to do with climate change and drought and flooding.
Sure.
But can you give us a specific example?
Well, I think I'd like to highlight one particular project, which is a multi-year project, which is unusual for the centres to do that, and that is the Dynamic Coast project, which was led by the University of Glasgow. And it was really the first ever comprehensive analysis of the impact of coastal erosion around Scotland. And it's an online resource. People can go and check it out, and you'll find it in Dynamic Coast or the link to it through the Centre of Expertise for Water. But it identified that, over 1.2 billion of assets are at risk by 2050. And I think getting that realization in people's minds that we live in a very dynamic environment and that is going to be influenced by global changes is really a very, very powerful message. But it's trying to bring that knowledge to a local scale, which I think is also noteworthy.
Bob, can you tell us whether it's the East Coast or the West Coast then that's going to be most affected?
Well, it depends. Well, I think I would encourage you to go and check that out for yourself. There are some notable assets on the East Coast that are concerned about their longer term sustainability, but there's also vulnerabilities on the West. So it's not one specific region, it's in many different locations.
But all that information's there on Cruise website.
Absolutely, and the islands.
And all their websites associated with all these centres, so I'd really encourage you to go along and look for more information there. Dom, I'm sure you can give us an example from the animal perspective.
Well, two, if I may, actually. As Charles has said earlier, the greenhouse gas emission part of farming, and particularly livestock production, is one of controversy and one of pressure on farming. So anything that we can do to help farmers avoid disease makes production of food from animals much more efficient. So essentially everything that we do is contributing to it, although that's not necessarily its original purpose. Nevertheless, even things about people's behaviour in adopting vaccination or biosecurity, increased biosecurity to avoid disease getting into their premises, increases the chances that they'll produce more efficiently. We have been asked to do, and we have produced work specifically on climate change scenarios, which are more about things that exist in Scotland that could be vectors of disease under climate change scenarios. So some of the ticks that live in Scotland can carry diseases to animals. Those diseases have been here for a long time. Under certain climate change predictions, the range of those ticks might get wider or higher and impact on farming in different areas. And by looking at that, you can begin to then model what are effective adaptation strategies to that. And the same could be true of midges and a disease called blue tongue, which is currently occurring a lot in continental Europe. We have had it in Scotland before, but we haven't for a long time. If we were to get it, then the impact would be potentially pretty serious. So we'd much prefer not to.
Thanks, Dom. An interesting point in terms of encouraging natural regeneration of woodlands in Scotland. Is there not an interaction there with tick prevalence?
Yeah, I think there is. And I was at a meeting on sustainable farming a little while ago, a couple of weeks ago really, where somebody said very well that the problem with climate change is a lot of headlines around it, which tend to simplify things, and actually sometimes the devil's in the detail. So I think clearly there's a lot of interest in reforestation, but we also know that forest can be a very pleasant place for ticks to be. And so one of the things that's brilliant about being a centre of expertise among centres of expertise is that we have peripheral awareness of what we're doing. And maybe there are ways we could look at to do that tree planting in such a way that it was really good from an environmental point of view, but also didn't create a lot of habitat for things that might be vectors of disease to animals and or people.
And I'm sorry, I've got to ask you this, but you mentioned the midgie word there. Can you tell us how climate change is impacting on midges in Scotland?
Not in a short, not in a very quick way. It's too complicated.
We'll get more on that complicated one later.
No,
thanks, Dom. Sorry.
Not quickly.
Fiona, can you give us an example where obviously the Plant Health Centre has saved some plants that have been diseases that have been coming into Scotland?
Well, I mean, trees have had several mentions. So at a really simplistic level, this is not just about new plantings and new schemes. It's, if you could preserve existing trees, some large mature trees store up to 20 tonnes of carbon, and there are millions of trees. So if we can keep Phytophthora out, if we can keep Xylella out, the savings there are massive. I was going to reference, you let Dom have two examples, so I'm going to have two as well. So a piece of work that we did, again, agricultural production in Scotland is huge. We know that about 15 to 20% is at risk from pests and diseases, so you can quite quickly do multipliers that say there's about 1 million tonnes at risk. And we've seen, quite rightly, pesticides under heavy review, and Scottish Government particularly wanted to know what the impacts in Scotland would be. So a number of kind of key losses that hit to very key sectors. And again, you can do the maths different ways, but even a 1% loss in yield from a loss of a pesticide could add up to sort of 50,000 tonnes of carbon a year. So again, that's sort of heading to the route where we go, some of the integrated pest management measures are slower to develop and not quite with us now. So working particularly to support key industries, so if we pick soft fruit that's particularly at risk, support them into that transit into more integrated measures of control, but also just working to steward, if we can retain some of the key pesticides for that little bit longer by stewarding them more carefully, just that extra couple of years makes all the difference to those And it might only be 1 or 2% losses in terms of, yield, but the carbon calculations around that are absolutely huge. So I think that's just one of the pieces that we would point to as where the Plant Health Centre has had impact, Lorna.
That's fantastic, fascinating. I would just want to ask you a question about where we get I know you work closely with SASA, but where we get our stocks of trees that are then planted in the new woodlands that are being planted across Scotland. Are there sources within our country that we can control the potential pests that are on them?
And this is a really key piece. So that whole idea that you could source local, and I mean actually regeneration would be the safest way to do this. And at the other end of the spectrum, I talked about ash dieback earlier. That was an example where we were, in fact, there were practices where we were exporting seed to have it grown cheaply elsewhere, importing it back with all the diseases that came back with it, moving stuff around. The whole lack of awareness around where stuff is sourced from is absolutely key, and one of the kind of key principles we're trying to go at. So kind of sourcing with care and keeping it clean, really important. I mean, in short, the kind of local supply of tree seed is, it varies by year. It's not easy to do, so there's a lot of work to do to just source stuff safely.
And a lot of work still to do in awareness raising in these issues too.
That's a huge place. If you'd gone as far as pressing me to where the real challenges are, we have interested in other people's experience on the hard to reach sectors. So there are people for whom the impact of plant health is just not there, and a lack of clarity around who's responsible. If you're planting a big woodland, who's responsible for ensuring that it's sourced carefully and that it's healthy? There are really key bits, and people, we talk a lot about hard to reach stakeholders. That would be my challenge.
So still a big role for the Plant Health Centre, obviously. Yeah. Charles, from the SEFARI Gateway perspective, can you give me an example that's delivered to our climate emergency?
Well, the one I'll pick up, I mentioned in brief earlier, was the work that Gateway did for the Just Transition Commission. A fellowship there carried out a review of international perspectives on just transition, looking at lessons learned, good practice examples that could be applied within Scotland, and that helped to influence the Just Transitions Commission's report, and indeed as a separate entity in its own right on the that you can read as a standalone report as well. And we also helped there as Gateway in terms of brokering that Commission's engagement with the land use sector as well. And that was, again, extremely important to get contact with that very diverse sector. That's not just farming, but that's people who utilise land in many ways, from business through to leisure, and indeed just living in communities and the way they view the land that shapes their perception of the place where they live and work. And I think that obviously just transitions is a crucial feature of response to the climate emergency. It's vital we don't leave any part of society or sectors behind. The danger of doing that is huge because it could derail climate action. So I think that piece of work has obviously been important to the Commission. It's also been important to us. It's helped us in Gateway to frame the events that we've undertaken at this COP, and its thinking and the findings in that report permeate other work that has been undertaken in other Gateway projects. For example, where we've been looking at roles of food innovation clustering in the Highlands, how you get sustainable relationships between communities and industry, all part of that just transitions agenda. So being very informative to us as well as outwardly to the Commission itself.
Thank you, Charles. And again, that's another example of the effective secondment of a fellow into the Just Transition Commission. And it really was powerful, that association, as we heard from Graeme. Graeme, can you give us some other examples as well?
So I was thinking, I'm going to be greedy and do two, but very different, very different. So the first is one that's sort of that's ongoing over at CXE, and is about the learning lessons from what happened with COVID and the behaviour changes that happened very quickly with COVID, and people's travel behaviours changing, people's all sorts of work behaviours changing, and which I think we got up and running through CXC almost, almost instantly. And it's a really interesting set of studies, and it's been continued and been continued because we're still here. And to me, that's been a really interesting study to watch, and the lessons coming out of that have been really interesting. Because I think when we first all came into COVID, a lot of people thought, oh, well, here's one crisis. How do we learn for, the wider climate crisis? And I think it's been interesting to see how different some things are and how possible others are. And that's certainly, that particular study done through CXC is one that I think is really interesting, and as I say, it's still ongoing. So it's a really quick turnaround setup, but it's been very flexible and continues to produce interesting and useful things for us. That's one. I think the other is just to maybe take a step back and think about the sort of the long term, and particularly with a view to the new Centre of Expertise in Biodiversity. One of the things that we're expecting there, which again links to climate change, is about the value added stuff. So I know that you guys are really good at the first conversation. So I've been in RESAS for a number of years, and I barely talked about biodiversity until quite recently. And I sort of thought, well, that's something for the specialists. I don't have to deal with it, that's fine. And that's how most organisations work. If you don't have to deal with something, you deal with all the things that are flashing red on your board and let the person next to you deal with them there. And I think what will be really interesting for the organisation is having a new centre that's set up that it deals with biodiversity and talks with a lot of people who've got new responsibilities on biodiversity, but have got very little understanding of what it is, what actions are likely to be needed, what they're likely to have to do. And I think thinking about all of your different centres, if you think back to the first conversations you had with the policy teams, and also that process of sort of domesticating people, that when government has a high churn, that's a conscious decision, that's not an accident. And so there will always be a lot of people coming through who have to have first conversations in an area with you about, what is climate change, what's the evidence in our area. And those kinds of things are really valuable, because it means that there's reliable expertise in a place we can go to, we know where we can get it, but also learning how to talk to new staff, talk to people who have responsibilities in climate change, maybe in transport, or in education or in health, but who have it's not until now been a part of their day-to-day job. And so what is that first conversation like? And how do we think about the evidence there? And I think that's a really useful role that the centres can play, which is distinct and which is a different role to somebody who's, if you're not used to dealing with us, we're difficult to deal with. But also, from a government point of view, academics are difficult to deal with. So having an intermediary set of organisations is a really valuable value-added point there.
Thanks, Graeme. Now, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to go to each one of the panel, and I'm going to ask you something that has come about during this COP. Dave, I'm going to ask you about the 100 countries that have signed up to Deforestation Pledge to begin with the 2030. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mentioned that a little bit before. So week one of COP was lots of announcements, as you'd expect, some more ambition from particular countries, some long-term targets, for instance, from India. So that's the kind of stuff we need from COP. We need a hell of a lot more of it actually this week as well. But what we've also seen is on particular areas there have been some really positive announcements. So there's one on methane led by the US. There was this, as you say, this commitment from a lot of nations, key stakeholders to end deforestation by 2030. And it's really interesting looking at that announcement, because we've had announcements like that before. The difference with this one is kind of learning by doing and learning by failure, if I'm honest, because what it's really overt about is that needs money. It needs kind of a lot of stakeholders, so not just national governments, but the industry involvement, and crucially, it needs involvement of Indigenous peoples, the people who are already actually looking after a lot of forest and supporting them to protect it. And across all of that is the evidence base. And where we are now with that commitment is we've got, again, going back to Scotland, huge amount of expertise here in terms of our own land use and remote sensing and understanding change, but we are an international, hub of expertise on that, so we will be supporting that internationally. But beneath that, it's that kind of, the deforestation targets they're great to see, but underneath it, the drivers of deforestation are very different depending on where you are. And so the social science actually is one of the things which I think, again, we do really well in Scotland and across our centres. We know even if, like, I'm a physical scientist, and I know that's not even half of the answer in terms of climate solutions and tackling these challenges. And so one of the things from that commitment that seems to be overt is actually making sure, yes, the physical science and the evidence base is underpinning it, but actually the social science is integrated into that, understanding the people. And that's exactly the kind of thing I think, again, we can point to in Scotland and say we've made some of those mistakes in the past, but actually we've now kind of recognised that and are actually taking that integrated approach. So yeah, really hopeful this latest deforestation commitment is actually followed through with.
Thank you. And it's people, place and communities across the world. And the pledge by India to set 2017 net zero target, renewable energy mix to 50% by 2030. How do you see in Scotland the hydropower plays a role in that?
Hydropower, well, Scotland has a long historical legacy in the development of hydropower, the sort of power from the glens initiatives that were done in the last century, and so we have a bank of quite considerable hydropower. In fact, we by far have the largest proportion of hydropower in the UK and Scotland. So, and I think we all know that it's an absolutely critical part of our energy mix going forward. We're also reminded of the instantaneousness of hydropower at critical times, like when we all want to switch on the kettle after EastEnders, apparently. So it has an important role across lots of different dynamics within the energy sector, apart from just being a contributor. But maybe it's worthwhile just expanding that whole water and energy thing out a little bit better, because water is dense, it's quite heavy, it takes power to shift it about. It takes power to pump it around and treat it, it takes power to pump it around and clean it up. And so water has a relationship with power, an intimate relationship with power. And I think in Scotland we're very lucky that our public-owned utilities, Scottish Water, is a really global exemplar of how to set ambitious targets to meet net zero and to decarbonise and to green the whole process around water. And I think it's a real flagship for Scotland, and we should be very proud of it. And indeed, water, of course, is critical to the food and drink industry, and it's critical in manufacturing. And it's great to see increases in water use efficiency in those sectors, and actually trying to extract the value that we have in many of our waste streams in water, be it heat or nutrients and so on. So water is also part of that circular economy. And again, that's all about being more efficient with our energy use and the carbon burden of water. But I think it also comes down to people, because when we switch on our taps, particularly in a water-rich country like Scotland, we see water, we don't see carbon, and we don't see energy. And maybe if we thought in those terms, our behaviours would change a little bit. So for COP26, the one thing we can do, be a little bit more water-wise. Just be a little more efficient in what we do with that resource.
Water-wise, water awareness.
Absolutely.
I think I quite like the example that you used of the relationship that the centre has built up with Scottish Water, for example, and we've heard it across all the centres, those trusted relationships are so important.
Yes, indeed, and to show the sort of leadership in Scotland, Scottish Water is now with Scottish Government established a hydronation chair with Andrew Tyler at Stirling to help support, again, that whole green transition. So it's very long.
Brilliant. And Dom, the 45 governments that have pledged to cut farming emissions to protect nature and shift to more sustainable ways of farming. Can you comment on that? Will that happen?
I think it will. I think everybody is minded that farming needs to play its part and to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And I think farming very much sees itself as part of the solution. There's no doubt, there's a growing world population that needs feeding, and people are talking about behavioural change around diet, but there's no doubt that animal agriculture will continue to play an important part of food production for, indefinitely, as far as I'm concerned. And so, I'm confident that it's very difficult to sort of pick on one particular thing. We talked before about disease avoidance and biosecurity. That's really important. Technology in developing vaccines particularly is probably very important. And again, alongside this agenda, people have made reference to once or twice about, particularly Fiona, in relation to sort of restrictions on some pesticides and drugs, and obviously in animal agriculture, antimicrobial resistance is a big concern. In Scotland, anthelmintic resistance is a really big concern. It probably gets less headlines because it's less relevant to public health in this country. But generally speaking, being better able to manage the relationship between our animals and the microbiome is critically important, and I think there's a huge amount of research that needs to be done there. We're very focused, and because of COVID, we're extremely focused on pathogens, but we're not really thinking about how those pathogens exist in the sort of microflora that inhabit us and that we share the planet with. And again, I think the relationship between plants and microbes is something that is not my field at all, but by having a plant health centre person there, the opportunity for us to cross-fertilise and find innovative ways to do these things more sensitively it's a wonderful time to be thinking about those challenges and trying to address them and deliver those things while sustaining a food supply.
And having that one health from our soil, our plants, our animals, and ultimately to the human gut as well.
For sure.
And it's interesting as well, the International Methane Agreement of 100 countries committed to cut emissions of methane, responsible for a third of the global temperature rise that we've had in the industrial nations. Can you comment on that, Fiona?
I mean, again, the impact of agriculture here is key, but I think it's already been said, they can be part of the solutions as well. And I think it's a linked system, so of course we can't point to one thing that will make the difference. But, Scotland's traditional agriculture was mixed and incorporated animals there. Coming from a plant health angle, the methane story is smaller. Our main issue there is around the nitrous oxides and the fertilisers. So we know these, we can't pick one thing, but we can pick the priorities. So better and more efficient use of fertilisers, and that might be examples where we have animals restoring the fertility of land in key ways. So again, that connectivity between the centres is key. We know that things like incorporating more legumes are important, but we also know that in Scotland that can be challenging because of the existing climate and because we don't have the markets. So we import soya for animals, but we could actually develop a homegrown market. So the connectivity here is just huge. So these are really ambitious things to go at, and there are solutions. We've got a good idea of the priorities, but we just need to work together, because otherwise the unforeseen consequences of me fiddling in a plant health box and not thinking about the knock-on effects could be counterproductive.
And that's the great thing about a country like Scotland, when we've got all all the centres working together, because these are not a single issue topic. They all interrelate. And what better use of our uplands for carbon sequestration than the grazing lands on the west coast of Scotland? So anyway, Charles, I'm going to ask you, the South Africa have been paid to ditch coal from the US and Europe. Is that the end of coal?
Right. Gosh, well, at least you weren't asking me the carbon pricing question, which I was terrified was might be coming my way at some point there. I don't know if you are asking a carbon pricing one, but I was worried that there might be one. Is it the end of coal? I think not. It should be. We have to move to end coal. We obviously have to accelerate that process. I think there is both an economic and a political reality in the world that will impact on that. So we're going to see that some nations will move at a different pace and with different influence in that process. The fact that we are starting to move in the right direction, yeah, I absolutely agree with the campaigners. The pace and scale is not high enough, but move is occurring. And they need to keep up the pressure to keep that move happening. And ourselves, our own governments, need to hold each other to account to drive that reduction in coal use and see it eliminated.
Thank you, Charles. And Graeme, the countries have backed technical plan to hit net zero with innovation. 40 nations are backing, giving developing countries access to innovation and tools to make that shift to net zero of carbon emissions. Is that going to be possible, do you think, Graeme?
I don't know. It's one of those things. So one of the things that I was wondering if I would mention or not, but we have a commitment publicly that our centres, or the two at the end, CXE and CREW, we will support them to do partnership working with the developing world. And I know we've had several conversations about how in practice we do that, because we're not a big funder of overseas development, and they're not all large organisations. So we have to come up with sensible ways to do that. I think that's one direct support. I think there's another thing that we can think about, which is that all of the research and all of the development is made open and available so that people can find it in ways that are cheap, accessible, and so on, which is something that we're aiming to support. And I think that the last thing is just to think on the innovation side, what we can do to support innovation that is genuinely transformational. So the thing that jumps out to me is vertical farming. And I know there's a vertical farm down at the centre you can go and have a look at. Obviously Hutton has one, SIC is getting one. And I think it's something where Scotland is clearly, we've got a first mover advantage, we're leaders in this field. But I think we've also got some really interesting questions longer term about what does it mean for our landscape if we're moving the burden of doing certain things into other places. What does it mean about our food system? What does it mean about where we produce, where we consume? All of those kinds of questions. And I think that's the kind of question where the centres looking across the piece will be really, really interesting, because there's different questions on each of those things for the consequence of something that is, I think, a radically new technology. I mean, in 10 years' time, it will be standard and we won't think about it. But we'll be in a different world, and we won't have, so I think there's some really interesting questions coming down the pipeline, and I think we're really well placed to look at them.
Thank you, Graeme. And I just think that there's so much here more to do, and we can see the linkages of what's happening across the world, right down to what's happening in individual communities in Scotland. But here in Scotland, we're fortunate because we've got these centres of expertise and these wonderful people running these centres, and a new centre that's going to be started soon as well. All working together with trust, having that direction of travel, connectivity, knowing the stakeholders, being able to co-construct, produce legacy information, credibility, context, and relevance. Make it relevant so that there's behaviour change, making life better for the people of Scotland, and also to make our future and our children's and our grandchildren's futures safer and better, to look at ways that we can redress this climate emergency, biodiversity crisis, and move forward and all work together, and hopefully there'll be resolution and there will be opportunities for more working together, more innovation and more success in the future. Thank you to the panel for their wonderful answers to the questions. Thank you. And thank you, the audience, for listening and responding today. And also I'd like to say thank you to Tapestry for filming this today. So hopefully this will be able to be shared with others, wider audience across Scotland, across the UK and across the world. Thank you very much, everyone. Safe journey home.